On August 6, 1806, a man named Francis abdicated his throne at the demand of an upstart French corporal-turned-emperor named Napoleon Bonaparte. When Francis II, emperor of what was by that time known as the Holy Roman Empire, abdicated the throne at Napoleon's demand, he effectively ended a 1,000-year-old empire that started in the year 800 with a Frankish king named Karl, known to history as Charlemagne. Charlemagne, with authority from Pope Leo III, would be crowned Imperator Romanorum, or Emperor of the Romans. Such an emperor had not existed in Western Europe since the fall of Rome in 476. Nevertheless, Charlemagne was about to become the very first leader of the subject of this podcast, the Holy Roman Empire. The French philosopher Voltaire famously quipped that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. And during Voltaire's life that may have been true, but at the outset of Charlemagne's reign as Emperor of the Romans, it seems a perfect description. The dominion of Charles was holy, in that Pope Leo was officially sanctioning him to be the main protector of the Christian faith and of the papacy itself from the Lombards in Italy. It was Roman, because Leo had conferred onto Charles the legacy of the Caesars of old, and it was an empire, because Charles actively sought to expand it for the remainder of his reign. With such a fitting descriptor, it would be easy to assume that the empire of Charlemagne was always called the Holy Roman Empire. However, this exact terminology wasn't used until much later. Robert Hurstein of the Carnegie Institute addresses this in the introduction of the book, The Holy Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, saying, quote, "The term Holy Roman Empire was not prevalent until the 12th century, and the adjectival suffix, of the German nation, did not become even quasi-official until the reign of Maximilian I." End quote. So then, what exactly were Leo and Charlemagne's intentions on that fateful Christmas morning, as one crowned the other the rightful inheritor of history's greatest empire? Historians disagree on either of the two men's intentions, and the debate is one that continues even today. Some say Charlemagne was simply seeking a higher glory than had ever been achieved by a Frankish ruler, nothing more than an opportunistic power grab to bolster his ego. Others claim that he viewed his crowning as a pleasant surprise, a byproduct of his conquests, and that for the price of protecting the Pope and defending Christianity in the West, he could receive a higher honor than even he had ever dreamt. Personally, I think the truth entails a little bit of both of these theories. Pope Leo sought protection from himself from potential enemies, and Charlemagne was willing to help him in that regard. Plus, it's hard to turn down a cool title and a shiny new crown. In this episode, the first of a 4-part series, I'm going to focus on the life of Charlemagne and the events that led to his crowning. Eventually, we'll get to discussing the ins and outs of the Holy Roman Empire itself, but the story of Charles serves both as a rational starting point for discussing the empire, as well as presents us with a great historical character with which to start off our story. I want to thank you ahead of time for listening, and I hope you'll stay with me for the rest of it. Part 1. The Life of Charles. Charlemagne, who I will henceforth be referring to as Charlemagne and Charles interchangeably, was probably born April 2nd, in the year 742, although there is some disagreement among the sources. It should be noted that if Charlemagne was truly born in 742, that would technically have made him illegitimate, as his parents weren't married until 744. Nevertheless, we will stick with a consensus and go with 742. Like most people from this time period, we know next to nothing about Charlemagne's early life, except that he was the son of his father, the Frankish king Pepin the Short, and his mother, Bertrada of Laon. We can reasonably surmise that as the son of royalty, his early life would have been somewhat more privileged than that of most common people, but without definitive sourcing on the matter, it would be hard to say for sure. In his chronicle, succinctly titled Life of Charlemagne, the Frankish scholar Einhard says, quote, "I consider that it would be foolish for me to write about Charlemagne's birth and childhood, or even about his boyhood, for nothing is set down in writing about this, and nobody can be found still alive who claims to have any personal knowledge of these matters." End quote. I don't think it would be unfair to say that Charlemagne's life can be described thusly. He was born, some stuff happened, he conquered all of Western Europe, got crowned emperor, then died 14 years later. This is to say, much of the life of Charles is lost to the fog of history, and that this is frustrating beyond belief to historians and enjoyers of a good, clear storyline anywhere. And seeing as, like I mentioned, Charles truly did conquer basically all of Western Europe, it seems abrupt that such a man could live an otherwise uneventful life up until manhood, go on a conquering frenzy, and then die 14 years after his greatest triumph. Despite this, however, the historian and author of Volume 1 of his 2-part series titled An Introduction to the History of Western Europe, James Harvey Robinson, makes the case that Charlemagne is actually one of the first Germanic people of whom we actually have any semblance of a detailed history, saying, quote, "Charlemagne is the first historical personage among the German peoples of whom we have any satisfactory knowledge. Compared with him, Theodoric, Charles Martel, Pippin, and the rest are but shadowy figures. The chronicles tell us something of their deeds, but we can only make the vaguest inferences in regard to their character and temperament." End quote. I think that quote does a great job of showing the extent to which we are at the mercy of the sources, insofar as the telling of Charlemagne, or any historical figure for that matter. It is for this reason that I have tried to stick as closely to the sources as possible, all the while trying to convey the epic story of Charlemagne and the wider narrative of the Holy Roman Empire in as entertaining a way as possible. And with the story of Charlemagne in mind, if I'm going to tell you the story of the man, it is necessary for us to understand the sheer military and political force that was the Frankish Empire under his father Pepin. Pepin the Short, father of Charlemagne, saw fit to divide his kingdoms among his sons, Charles, named for Pepin's father, Charles Martel, of the Battle of Tours fame, and Carloman, named for Pepin's brother. This is also probably a good time to warn you, there's going to be a lot of geography involved ahead, so I've seen fit to attach several maps in the show notes to help you visualize. Now, if you went to look at the maps, you'll notice that the kingdoms of the two brothers were oddly shaped, with Charles's western half forming a half-moon shape around the exterior of Carloman's eastern half. In Pepin's mind, the odd shape of the two kingdoms would ensure that neither son got too ambitious and declared war on the other for their respective claims. As we will later delve into, however, such a conquest would not be necessary, as Carloman would, perhaps suspiciously, die not long after. Nevertheless, after the death of Pepin the Short, the Frankish kingdom was divided in two, and Charlemagne wasted no time solidifying his half. Part 2. Early Victories for Charles. The first military victory with which Einhard credits Charles is that of the defeat of the rebellion in the Duchy of Aquitaine, located in the south of France. The war in Aquitaine had started during Pepin's reign, and, upon the elder's death, young Charlemagne inherited the conflict. Einhard, staying true to the brevity displayed throughout the rest of his biography of his patron and friend Charles, is short on details about the conquest, saying only that Carloman refused to help his older brother in the war, no doubt upsetting Charles and adding fuel to the speculation that Carloman was killed on Charles's orders. Despite this, though, Charles subdued Aquitaine successfully, adding the first of what would become many conquests to his resume. Soon after Charles had put down the rebellion, his brother died, leaving Charles the sole ruler of the Frankish Empire. As I mentioned earlier, Carloman's death is surrounded with controversy and intrigue due to his suddenness and convenience to Charles. There are many theories about how or why Carloman died, but the official story is that he died of a nosebleed, and though I have neither the authority or conclusive enough evidence to suggest otherwise, it is extremely fortunate for Charles that his brother just happened to die at a time when Charles had motive in the potential to inherit Carloman's kingdom, and reason, after Carloman's snub of Charles in the Aquitanian Rebellion, to have his brother killed. Regardless, however, in 772, Charles stood unopposed as the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. After the death of his brother, Charles's next venture lay on the Italian peninsula. The Lombards, referred to by Einhard as the no doubt historically accurate but unintentionally hilarious Longobards, had been harassing the Pope since the days of Pepin the Short, and Pepin had come to Rome's defense on two separate occasions. This de facto title of Protector of the Papacy that the Franks had assumed would be a crucial factor in the Pope's decision to officially sanction Charlemagne as such in reality. This is a crucial concept to understand for the rest of the series, that the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire's legitimacy began with Pepin and his defense of the Pope, and his son's continuation of this practice. If either Pepin or Charlemagne had ignored the Pope's request for help against the Lombards, there very well may not have been a Holy Roman Empire in the first place, and then you wouldn't be listening to this series. Robinson describes the Lombards under King Desiderius attacking Rome after Pepin's death, saying, quote, "Pippin, it will be remembered, had covenanted with the papacy to protect it from its adversaries. The king of the Lombards had taken advantage of Charlemagne's seeming preoccupation with his German affairs again to attack the city of Rome." End quote. Robinson then goes on to describe the short war that would ensue, saying, quote, "The Pope immediately demanded the aid of Charlemagne, who prepared to carry out his father's pledges. He ordered the Lombard ruler to return the cities that he had taken from the Pope. Upon Desiderius' refusal to do this, Charlemagne invaded Lombardy in 773 with a great army and took Pavia, the capital, after a long siege. Desiderius was forced to become a monk, and his treasure was divided among the Frankish soldiers. Charlemagne then took the extremely important step in 774 of having himself recognized by all of the Lombard dukes and counts as king of the Lombards." End quote. After adding the Lombard kingdom to his already expansive empire, Charles set his sights to the northeast, where he would meet his next enemy, the Saxons. Part 3. German Wars. Astute students of history likely noticed and took issue with the fact that I titled this section The German Wars. This is of course due to the fact that Germany, I'm doing air quotes when I say that, as a nation did not exist at this time. In fact, Germany did not exist concretely as a sovereign nation until 1871. Now this fact is relevant to our narrow story about Charlemagne, as well as the broader detailing of the history of the Holy Roman Empire, because many historians see the aforementioned empire as one of the main reasons that Germany was not established until so late in the game. German historian George von Bellow wrote on this topic, saying, quote, "The fact that the resultant weakening of the German central authority made itself felt in the lack of internal unity that we see in Germany and Italy until the late 19th century." End quote. Bellow is here referring to the later Holy Roman Empire's sort of purgatorial existence as both a vessel of the Pope's authority, as the stand-in for God on earth, while also being an actual political entity with secular military power. The fact that the empire was neither solely an entity of the Church, nor a purely secular bureaucratic state, meant that it suspended the German peoples in this halfway developmental stage that stopped them from fully unifying under their existing nationalistic pretenses. This concept is a crucial addendum to our understanding from Part 2, where we initially introduced the concept of the Holy Roman Empire as protector of the faith. With our big picture concepts in mind, we now return to Charles at the beginning of his conquests in, air quotes here, Germany. Saxony, located in the easternmost part of the middle section of modern-day Germany, fought with the Franks for more than 30 years under Charlemagne's rule. As the constant thorn in his side, the Saxons were often dealt with harshly by Charles, and dealt harshly in return. If nothing else, Charles's conduct in Saxony serves as an example of how there can truly be no such thing as a just empire. Charles, in an effort to both subjugate the Saxon peoples and convert them to Christianity, at one point allegedly massacred 4,500 Saxons in cold blood in retribution for a rebellion. While this event is obviously massively controversial, not least for the fact that the Nazi government used it as propaganda to attest to supposed German racial superiority, I should note that historians are not in agreement about the massacre. While the traditional narrative that Charles murdered 4,500 Saxons in cold blood after putting down the rebellion is the consensus, some historians disagree. The dissenting opinions seem to fall into a few different camps. Some of these claim that the 4,500 number is grossly inflated, whether on purpose or by accident of historical inaccuracy, others claiming that it couldn't have happened as the traditional narrative suggests, due to the fact that such a heinous act would likely have caused an even more ferocious defiance from the Saxons, and that Charles would have been aware of this. Having presented the prevailing opinions of the experts, I will simply state my opinion thusly. Assuming that Charles did indeed massacre the Saxons, this proves as a stark and gruesome reminder of the inherent cruelty of imperialism and of warfare in general. And though this episode seeks to tell the story of Charles, we shouldn't shy away from the negative aspects of his rule, and we certainly shouldn't attempt to minimize his or any other historical figure's wrongdoings in an attempt to turn real people from the past into mythical characters who were purely evil or purely good. This serves only to ensure that we won't learn anything from them, and that we will make the same mistakes again. As I step down from my soapbox, we can now look at Einhardt's version of the Saxon Wars for a great example of bias in favor of his friend. Of the war, Einhardt says, quote, "The Saxons, like almost all of the people living in Germany, are ferocious by nature. They are much given to devil worship, and they are hostile to our religion. They think it no dishonor to violate and transgress the laws of God and man. Hardly a day passed without some incident or other which was well calculated to break the peace." He then goes on to try to excuse Charles's cruelty by saying, quote, "Not once did he allow anyone who had offended to go unpunished. He took vengeance in them for their perfidy, and meted out suitable punishment." End quote. This take on Charles's conquest of Saxony is clearly biased, and aims to have us believe that Charles simply had no choice but to punish those damn savages for offending on their occupiers so harshly. I should note that one of the professionals on the subject who advised me for this podcast asked me to consider that Einhardt was not telling the story so favorably for Charles because he was some hired spin doctor, but rather because Einhardt truly believed in Charles, as a person and as a friend, and that if his coverage of these events seems one-sided, it is due to Einhardt's belief in the cause of Charlemagne, and not because he was getting paid to describe it in a certain way. I think that informed people can agree to the logic of either of these arguments and make their decision one way or the other. Nevertheless, despite his ferocity against the Saxons, or perhaps because of it, Charles finally won the war to subjugate the Saxon peoples.